You have to remember that sugar wasn't really a thing in medieval Europe, not for most people anyway. Cane sugar was an expensive import, a luxury spice that only the very wealthy could afford. It was sold by the ounce, right alongside saffron and pepper. For everyone else, from the peasant in his hut to the lord in his hall, the main source of sweetness was honey. It was the only concentrated sweetener they knew, and because of that, it was in everything. Imagine a world without sugar packets, without granulated sugar for your baking, without corn syrup and processed foods. That was the medieval world. Honey did all the work. When a cook wanted to sweeten a dish, they reached for honey. It went into porridge in the morning to make it more palatable. It was baked into cakes and breads, giving them a dense, moist texture and a rich, floral sweetness that would be very different from the light, sugary cakes we know today. The flavor of the honey itself was important. It wasn't just a generic sweetener. The taste changed depending on where the bees got their nectar. Honey from an area with a lot of clover would be light and mild. Honey from a forest with chestnut trees would be dark, strong, and almost bitter. People knew these differences. A good cook would choose a specific type of honey for a specific dish, just like a modern chef might choose a specific type of olive oil. It was also used heavily in sauces. Medieval cuisine, especially for the upper classes, was full of complex, flavorful sauces. They loved the combination of sweet and sour. A common sauce might be made from wine or vinegar, thickened with breadcrumbs, and then sweetened with a generous amount of honey. This sauce would then be poured over roasted meats like pork, duck, or venison. The honey would balance the acidity of the vinegar and add a depth of flavor. It also helped to create a thick, sticky glaze on roasted foods, something that was highly prized. But honey wasn't just for the rich. Every level of society used it. A peasant might have a single beehive, called a skep, in their garden. This hive would provide enough honey for their family's needs throughout the year. It was a vital resource. It made their simple, grain-based diet more enjoyable. A spoonful of honey could turn a bland bowl of oats into a treat. It was a small comfort in a hard life. Beyond just making food taste good, honey had another crucial job. It was a preservative. Honey has very low water content and is naturally acidic. This means that bacteria and other microorganisms can't grow in it. It's a hostile environment for spoilage. The medievals understood this, even if they didn't know the science behind it. They used honey to preserve fruits. They would pack berries, plums, or other small fruits in jars and cover them completely with honey. The honey would draw the water out of the fruit and protect it from rot. This way, they could enjoy the taste of summer fruit in the dead of winter. It was a way to store calories and nutrients for the lean months. And this preservative quality was also used for other things. Sometimes meat was stored in honey, although this was less common as salt was the primary meat preservative. But for things that needed to stay moist and sweet, honey was perfect. It was used to make preserved ginger and other spiced confections, which were considered both a treat and a type of medicine. The texture of honey was also important. It added body and moisture to baked goods. A honey cake would last much longer without going stale than a cake made with a dry sweetener. It was also used to make candies and sweets. By boiling honey, sometimes with nuts or spices, they could create simple confections. These were not the complex candies we have today, but they were a special treat, often enjoyed at feasts or during holidays. So, when you think of a medieval kitchen, don't picture bags of sugar. Picture a pot of honey. It was a fundamental ingredient, as basic as flour or salt. It was on the table of the king to sweeten his wine and on the table of the farmer to sweeten his bread. It provided flavor, preservation, and much-needed calories. It was the taste of sweetness itself in a time when sweetness was a rare and precious thing. Without honey, the food of the Middle Ages would have been a very different and much blander experience. But honey wasn't just for eating, it was also for drinking. In fact, one of the most famous drinks of the ancient and medieval world was made from it. That drink was mead. Mead is, at its core, incredibly simple. It's just honey and water fermented with yeast. But that simplicity hides a huge amount of variety and a deep cultural importance. For many parts of medieval Europe, especially in the north like England, Scandinavia, and Germany, mead was a staple drink. Grapes for wine didn't grow well in these colder climates. Wine had to be imported from places like France, which made it very expensive. It was a drink for the rich, the nobility, and the church. Ale, made from fermented grain, was the everyday drink for the common person. It was cheap and easy to make. Mead sat somewhere in the middle, or sometimes at the very top. Making mead was a common practice. If you had honey, you could make mead. The process started by mixing honey with water. The ratio of honey to water would determine the final strength and sweetness of the drink. More honey meant a stronger, sweeter mead. Less honey meant a lighter, drier mead. This mixture, called mousse, would then be heated, sometimes with herbs or spices, to sterilize it and help the flavors combine. Then came the fermentation. Wild yeasts are present everywhere, even in honey itself. In early times, people might have just left the must in an open container and let nature take its course. But by the Middle Ages, they understood the process better. They would often add yeast from a previous batch of mead or ale to get the fermentation started quickly and reliably. The mixture would be left in a wooden barrel or a clay pot for weeks or months. During this time, the yeast would eat the sugars in the honey and convert them into alcohol. The result was mead, but it wasn't just one single thing. There were many different kinds. A basic mead was just honey and water. A mead made with fruit, like berries or apples, was called a melomel. One made with spices like cloves, nutmeg, or ginger was called a metheglin. In fact, the word medicine is related to the word metheglin because these spiced meads were often thought to have healing properties. A mead made with grape juice was called a piment. People experimented with whatever they had available. And mead played a huge role in society. It was the drink of celebration. You see it mentioned constantly in old poems and sagas like Beowulf. The Great Hall of the King is called the Mead Hall. It was the center of the community, where the lord and his warriors would gather to feast, tell stories, and drink mead from horns or goblets. Sharing mead was a way to build bonds of loyalty and friendship. A good lord was one who was generous with his mead. And it wasn't just for warriors and kings, though. Monasteries were major producers of mead. They kept large numbers of beehives for wax to make church candles, and the honey was a valuable byproduct. The monks became skilled brewers, creating high-quality meads that were consumed by the monastery and also sold or traded. In daily life, mead was a common beverage. It was safer to drink than water, which could often be contaminated. The alcohol in the mead killed harmful bacteria. A weak or small mead with a low alcohol content might have been drunk throughout the day, even by children, much like small beer was. It was a source of hydration and calories. The quality of mead varied greatly. A freshly made young mead might be rough and simple. But a mead that was aged for years in a wooden barrel could become as complex and refined as a fine wine. It would develop smooth, subtle flavors from the honey and the wood. These aged meads were highly prized and would be saved for special occasions. The tradition of the honeymoon is even said to come from mead. The story goes that a newly married couple would be given enough mead to last for one full moon. They were encouraged to drink it every day to promote fertility and happiness. Whether this is completely true or just a nice story, it shows how deeply mead was connected to life's important rituals. As the Middle Ages went on, mead's popularity started to decline in some areas. Beer brewing became more efficient and produced a cheaper product. Wine became more widely available through trade, but in many places, especially those with strong beekeeping traditions, mead remained a beloved drink. It was a direct product of the local landscape. A taste of the flowers and fields turned into a warm, intoxicating beverage. It was a link to the past, a drink of gods and heroes, but also a simple pleasure for the common person. It was much more than just a drink. It was a piece of the culture. Honey's role in the medieval world went far beyond the kitchen and the drinking hall. It was also one of the most important items in the medicine chest. For a medieval physician, a monk in an infirmary, or a village healer, honey was an essential tool. It wasn't just a folk remedy, it was a respected medical substance, recommended in the most advanced medical texts of the time. Its most important use was in treating wounds. Life in the Middle Ages was full of injuries. A farmer could get a bad cut from a scythe. A soldier could suffer a deep wound from a sword or an arrow. Infection was a constant and deadly threat. There were no antibiotics. A simple cut could easily become infected and lead to a slow, painful death. This is where honey came in. People knew that applying honey to a wound helped it heal. They saw that it kept wounds clean and prevented them from festering. We now know the scientific reasons why. Honey is a supersaturated sugar solution. This means it has very little available water. When you put it on a wound, it draws the water out of the bacteria through osmosis, killing them or at least stopping them from multiplying. Honey is also naturally acidic, which further inhibits bacterial growth. And when honey is diluted slightly by the fluids from a wound, an enzyme in it produces small amounts of hydrogen peroxide, which is a powerful antiseptic. A medieval healer wouldn't have known about osmosis or hydrogen peroxide, but they knew what worked. They would smear honey directly onto a wound or soak a piece of linen cloth in it to use as a dressing. It would create a protective barrier against dirt and flies while actively fighting infection. It also helped to reduce inflammation and scarring. For burns, honey was a go-to treatment. It soothed the pain and protected the damaged skin from infection as it healed, but its use wasn't limited to external wounds. Honey was a key ingredient in countless internal remedies. One of its most common uses, which has survived to this day, was for coughs and sore throats. A spoonful of honey, either on its own or mixed with herbs, would soothe an irritated throat and help to calm a cough. It was the base for many cough syrups and lozenges. They would mix honey with herbs like hyssop, licorice root, or thyme to create effective remedies for respiratory ailments. Medieval medicine was heavily based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors. Every substance, including food and medicine, was classified by its properties: hot, cold, wet, or dry. Honey was generally considered to be hot and dry. This meant it was used to treat conditions thought to be caused by an excess of cold and wet, like a chesty cough with a lot of phlegm. A doctor might prescribe a honey-based medicine to help the body dry out the excess phlegm and restore balance. Honey was also a perfect vehicle for other medicines. Many medicinal herbs are incredibly bitter and unpleasant to taste. Getting a sick person, especially a child, to take them could be a challenge. By mixing the powdered herbs or herbal extracts with honey, the healer could create a paste or syrup that was much easier to swallow. The honey masked the bad taste, and its thick texture made it easy to administer. This mixture was called an electuary. It was a very common way to dispense medicine. It was also seen as a general health tonic. People believed that consuming honey regularly was good for digestion and overall vitality. It was seen as a cleansing and purifying food. Some physicians recommended it for stomach ailments, believing it could soothe an upset stomach and help with digestion. It was an easily digestible source of energy, which was important for people who were sick and weak. The purity of the honey was considered important for medical use. The best honey for medicine was thought to be clear, pure, and from a known good source. Monasteries, with their well-tended apiaries and learned monks, were often the source of the highest quality medicinal honey and honey-based preparations. The infirmary, the monk in charge of the sick, would have had a large supply of honey on hand at all times. So, honey was a true multi-purpose medicine. It was an antiseptic bandage, a cough suppressant, a delivery system for bitter herbs, and a health tonic. It was practical, widely available, and most importantly, effective. In an age without modern pharmaceuticals, the simple golden liquid from the beehive was a powerful weapon in the fight against injury and disease. It saved lives and eased suffering in countless ways. It was nature's gift to the medieval pharmacy. When we think of a beehive, we naturally think of honey, but the bees produce another substance that was just as, if not more, valuable in the Middle Ages. That substance was beeswax. Honey and wax were the two great products of the hive, and you couldn't really get one without the other. To harvest the honey from a traditional hive, the honeycomb had to be removed and broken up. The honey was drained off, and what was left was the wax. This wax was then melted down, filtered to remove impurities, and formed into blocks. And that block of clean yellow beeswax was a precious commodity with a huge range of uses. Its most important use was for light. The vast majority of people in the Middle Ages lived in a world that was very dark after the sun went down. The most common source of artificial light was the tallow candle. Tallow was rendered animal fat. It was cheap and widely available, but it was awful stuff. Tallow candles sputtered and smoked, filling a room with a greasy black soot and a foul, acrid smell. The light they gave off was dim and flickered constantly. Beeswax candles were the complete opposite. They burned with a clean, bright, steady flame. They didn't produce smoke or soot. And instead of a nasty smell, they gave off a faint, pleasant, sweet scent of honey. They were in every way a superior source of light, but they were also much, much more expensive. Producing a pound of wax took a huge amount of work from the bees. It was a far rarer material than animal fat. Because of this, beeswax candles were a symbol of wealth and status. Only the rich could afford to light their homes with them. A great lord's hall might be lit with dozens of beeswax candles for a feast, a brilliant display of his prosperity. Everyone else may do with smelly tallow candles, rushlights, reeds dipped in fat, or just the light from the fireplace. But the single biggest consumer of beeswax was the Christian church. For the church, the purity of the beeswax candle had a deep religious significance. The clean, bright light was seen as a symbol of the divine light of Christ. The wax itself, produced by virgin bees, was a symbol of the Virgin Mary and the pure flesh of Jesus. The smoke-free flame meant that the prayers of the faithful could rise to heaven unimpeded. Because of this powerful symbolism, the Church decreed that the candles used in Mass, especially the great Paschal candle at Easter, had to be made of pure beeswax. Monasteries and cathedrals needed enormous quantities of beeswax candles for their daily services and ceremonies. This demand drove a massive industry. Monasteries became centers of beekeeping, not just for the honey, but specifically to ensure a steady supply of wax for their own use and to sell for profit. Beeswax became a form of currency used to pay tithes and taxes to the church. Beyond light, beeswax had many other practical uses. It was essential for communication and administration. Before self-sealing envelopes, letters, and official documents were sealed with wax to ensure they hadn't been tampered with. A blob of melted wax was dripped onto the document, and then a seal, often on a ring or a special stamp, was pressed into it. This left a unique impression. While cheaper sealing wax existed, beeswax, often colored red with vermilion, was used for important documents by kings, nobles, and bishops. It created a durable, flexible seal that wouldn't easily crack. Beeswax was also vital for artists and craftsmen. One of the most important techniques for making small metal objects was called lost wax casting. A sculptor would first create a detailed model of the object they wanted to make, say, a bronze buckle or a silver brooch out of beeswax. This wax model was then carefully covered in clay, leaving a small channel open. The clay was fired, which hardened it into a mold and at the same time melted the wax, which ran out through the channel. This left a perfect, hollow impression of the original model inside the clay. Molten metal was then poured into the mold. Once it cooled, the clay mold was broken away to reveal the finished metal object. This technique allowed for the creation of incredibly detailed and complex metalwork. There were countless other small uses. Wax was used to waterproof thread for sewing leather or making boat sails. It could be rubbed onto bowstrings to protect them from moisture. It was an ingredient in salves and cosmetics. Scribes and artists used wax tablets for temporary writing. A wooden frame was filled with a layer of colored beeswax, and a person could write on it with a pointed stylus. To erase the message, they just had to warm the tablet slightly and smooth the wax over. It was the medieval equivalent of a whiteboard. So, the beehive provided more than just food and drink. It provided light in the darkness, security for communication, a medium for artists, and a material for countless everyday needs. The beeswax was the hidden treasure of the hive, a substance that shaped religion, art, and daily life in quiet but essential ways. Because honey and wax were so incredibly useful, they were also incredibly valuable. They weren't just products, they were a form of wealth. The control of honey production was a serious economic matter, and the humble honeybee played a surprisingly large role in the medieval economy. Beekeeping was a specialized and respected profession. The person who cared for the bees was known as a beekeeper, an apiarist, or a bee master. On a large manor, the beekeeper was an important member of the staff, responsible for maintaining the lord's hives and ensuring a good harvest of honey and wax. They understood the bees' cycles, knew when to harvest, and how to protect the hives from pests like mice or bears. The hives themselves, called skeps, were usually dome-shaped baskets woven from straw or wicker. The beekeeper would help a new swarm of bees settle into a skep, and then leave them to build their combs and fill them with honey. Harvesting was a destructive process. The beekeeper would have to drive the bees out, often using smoke, and then take the honeycomb. Sometimes the entire colony was killed in the process, which was why it was so important to capture new swarms each year to start new hives. The products of these hives, honey and wax, were so valuable that they were often used as a form of payment. In a world where coins could be scarce, especially in rural areas, people relied heavily on barter and in-kind payments. A peasant farmer might not have much silver, but he might have a few beehives. His feudal rent to the lord of the manor might be specified not in cash, but in goods: a certain number of chickens, a portion of his grain harvest, and a measure of honey or a block of wax. This was a common arrangement. Legal documents and manor records from the period often list honey rents as part of a tenant's obligations. This made honey a kind of liquid currency. It was easily divisible, it stored well, and everyone needed it. You could trade it for other goods or use it to pay off a debt. The church, in particular, collected large amounts of honey and wax as tithes, a 10% tax on agricultural production. For many monasteries, beekeeping became a major economic activity. They had the land, the labor in the form of monks or lay brothers, and the organizational skills to manage large-scale apiaries with hundreds of hives. The Cistercian monks were especially known for their skill in agriculture, including beekeeping. They produced a surplus of honey and wax that they could sell at market, bringing in significant income for the monastery. The trade in honey and wax was a serious business. Towns and cities had markets where these goods were bought and sold. For merchants would buy honey from rural producers and transport it to urban centers where demand was high. The quality and origin of the honey could affect its price. A clear, light-colored honey would fetch a higher price than a dark, strong, flavored one. Wax was sold by weight, and its price was consistently high due to the huge demand from churches. And guilds of wax chandlers, the professional candle makers, were powerful and wealthy organizations in many cities. They controlled the trade and set standards for the quality of beeswax candles. The value of honey was also enshrined in law. Early medieval law codes, like those of the Welsh and the Anglo-Saxons, have specific sections dealing with bees. They set out the value of a swarm of bees, the fines for stealing a hive, and the rules about who owned a swarm if it flew from one person's land to another's. The fact that lawmakers took the time to write such detailed rules about bees shows just how important they were to the economy and to people's livelihoods. Owning bees was a form of wealth creation. A single hive could over time produce more hives, creating a self-sustaining source of valuable goods. This entire economic system was built on the simple fact that there was no good alternative. Before the 16th and 17th centuries, when sugar plantations in the New World began producing massive quantities of cheap cane sugar, honey had no real competitor. It was the only sweetener available on a large scale. It was a critical medical supply. And its byproduct, wax, was the only source of high-quality light. This monopoly made the bee one of the most important domesticated animals of the Middle Ages, right alongside the cow and the sheep. It was a tiny insect that produced a liquid gold, a substance that sweetened food, healed wounds, lit up the darkness, and fueled an entire economy.